Good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending our NWHM Presents Sundays at Home presentation, Inspiring a Movement, Commemorating Rosa Parks' Radical Activism, with special guest, Dr. Brenna Wynn Greer, Associate Professor of History at Wellesley College. My name is Ann Turgison, and I serve as the Director of Education at the National Women's History Museum here in Alexandria, Virginia. Founded in 1996, the National Women's History Museum is the nation's only comprehensive women's history museum and the most recognized institution dedicated to uncovering, interpreting, and celebrating women's diverse contributions to society. As a renowned leader in women's history education, the museum brings to life the countless untold stories of women throughout history and serves as a space for all to inspire, experience, collaborate, and amplify women's impact, past, present, and future. For nearly 25 years, the museum has served as the largest online cultural institution dedicated to U.S. women's history, and we're excited that in the coming years, women's history will have a physical home of its own in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, we continue our important work of sharing the powerful history of women in America and across the globe. We hope that after today's discussion, you'll find us on social media and join us in the important work of representation. The National Women's History Museum is offering virtual programs such as this one on select Sundays each month. If you enjoyed this program today, please continue to check our website for upcoming Sunday programs, throughout the month of February. Today's program is part of the NWHM's Black History Month celebration in honor of generations of African American women who have struggled through adversity to achieve full citizenship in American society and who have led, acted, inspired, and advocated for a better present and future for all generations of Americans. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this presentation so that it can be available on our website following the event. Dr. Greer will also be answering questions, so please don't be shy. If you have a question, please click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. You know, it was a chilly night on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Instead of going to the back of the bus, which was designated for African Americans, she sat in the front. When the bus started to fill up with white passengers, the bus driver asked Parks to move. She refused and was arrested and convicted of violating the laws of segregation. This single act of planned defiance became a defining moment for the modern American civil rights movement. On that note, please allow me to introduce our speaker. Dr. Brenna Wynn Greer is an historian of race, gender, and culture in the 20th century United States, who explores historical connections between capitalism, social movements, and visual culture. Her first book, Represented: The Black Image Makers Who Reimagined African American Citizenship, examines the historical circumstances that made media representation of Black citizenship good business in the post-war World War II era. She is currently at work on her second book, which examines the post-war development of Black commercial publishing and its significance within U.S. culture and Black life. A past Woodrow Wilson and ACLS Fellow, Dr. Greer is an Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography 2018 to 2020 Junior Fellow. As a faculty member at Wellesley College, she has held the Knafel Assistant Professor of Social Sciences Chair and been awarded the Anna and Samuel Pinansky Teaching Award. She teaches in topics in 20th century US and African American history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greer to WNHM Presents Sundays at Home.
Hello, everyone. I'm just gonna take over screen sharing here so that you can see my slides. Hopefully you are seeing the title slide here. I want to take a brief second to really extend my appreciation for this invitation. It's Black History Month, and Rosa Parks is someone that I've been studying for a long time, but I welcome any opportunity that I have to be able to kind of complicate the narrative on her. This past Thursday, as many of you may know, was Rosa Parks' birthday, and if she were alive, she'd be 108. But as it was, when she passed in 2005 at 92, she had lived a really full, complex life and a very full activist life. And that's something that I think really gets lost. I mean, obviously there's the idea of her as an activist, but the extent of that activism, I think, has been overshadowed by a popular idea of who Rosa Parks was. And that's what I want to kind of dig into today. When I speak of the popular Rosa Parks, I actually often share this image. Oops.
Excuse me, Dr. Greer, would
Yes.
you mind just putting a slideshow mode on your
Oh.
on your view? Because we're getting the whole
You're
thing.
getting the whole thing. Okay, let me see what's happening here.
There you go. That's perfect.
There we go. Is that good? Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you. All right. So, as I was saying, when I talk about the symbolic Rosa Parks, I often use this image of her with Jesse Jackson at the 1988 Democratic National Convention. And this was July 19th, the evening of July 19th. And Jesse Jackson was taking to the stage essentially to end his presidential campaign because the nomination was about to go to Michael Dukakis. And that night he praised God. He thanked his Rainbow Coalition of his audience. And then he said, all of us who are here think we are seated, but we're really standing on the shoulders of someone. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Rosa Parks, the mother of the civil rights movement. And then, as if on cue, and actually on cue, Jesse Jackson's wife brought Rosa Parks from the wings and brought her to stand right next to him. And he, as you can see here, he raised her hand in triumph. The audience applauded wildly, and then she was gone just as quickly as she came, led off by Jesse Jackson's son. And so some criticize this moment as being somewhat of a PR stunt, but it really speaks to me about what her value was as a symbol. Jesse Jackson activated her value, Rosa Parks' value as the mother of the civil rights movement, just by having her stand next to him. And that was very useful to him because it tied him to one of our great American stories. And just being in her proximity conferred on him a credibility and a morality, but also showed him as belonging to the same civil rights history that she did. But I think that this image, I chose this particular image of her, this older image of her, because it's the idea that I had in my head growing up of Rosa Parks. When I thought about the mother of the civil rights movement, I was taught, as I think many were, that Rosa Parks was an old or an elderly Black woman with tired feet who spontaneously broke character and then single-handedly launched the modern civil rights movement, and essentially by accident, or at least she was an accidental activist in that moment. And I held on to that vision of Rosa Parks well into my graduate studies in an Afro-American Studies program. And then when I came to teach history, I found that a lot, this is a widely held conception of Rosa Parks. And despite the fact that historians have been chipping away at it slowly, it continues to hold. And I think it's really, I think it's significant to consider that, because I think it has a lot of bearing on what we think about Rosa Parks, but also what we think about Black history or civil rights movement. And as was mentioned or explained in the introduction, Rosa Parks' symbolic value is rooted in her role in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, right? And again, yes, she was, headed home on the evening of December 1st, 1955. She boarded the bus, she sat in the middle where African Americans could seat as long as there were seats available for whites. The bus fills up, the bus driver tells her to, or tells the Black passengers to get up to give white patrons seats, and she refuses. Everyone else obliges and she refuses. And she's arrested that evening for doing so. And as you can see by these clips, she was taken to jail and she was released then on a $100 bond. And with her arrest, then Black Montgomery began the bus boycott. And so that's why she's linked as being the mother of this movement, right? And the bus boycott in and of itself is very significant because 95% of Black Montgomery went off the buses once she was arrested, right? This was a really successful movement. And it's significant because the bus was a primary form of transportation for many African Americans, especially African American women. Nevertheless, they stayed off the buses for 381 days. I find that a lot of people often think that the bus boycott was a rather quick movement, but it was actually over a year of organizing and a year of walking, right? And so When the bus boycott started, they formed, or local leaders, local Black leaders and activists formed the Montgomery Improvement Association to operate the boycott and to represent it. And they elected as their leader Martin Luther King Jr. And that's how King comes to the fore as a civil rights activist. He's only 26 at that point in time, but he becomes the spokesperson for the MIA and thus the boycott, and is assumed to be the leader of the boycott. And so he actually ends up, his symbolic image ends up pushing a lot of people out of the boycott history and then just civil rights history in general, including to some degree, I think, Rosa Parks, even in relationship to the Montgomery bus boycott. And so when I'm teaching or talking to people about the civil rights movement, I talk in terms of the popular civil rights narrative often. And I find that people typically identify one of three events as beginning the civil rights movement. Either it's the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that desegregated public schools, or it's the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Chicago boy who, supposedly whistled at a white woman while visiting family in Mississippi and was killed for doing so. But most often it's the Montgomery bus boycott, right? And so that's the beginning of the civil rights movement. And then Rosa Parks is the woman who launched the bus boycott, and thus her being identified as the mother of the civil rights movement. But that label or that idea of her confines her role, even within the boycott, to being arrested and being a galvanizing victim, both of which were true, but she had a much larger role even within the bus boycott, let alone the broader Black freedom movement, which I'll talk more about in just a second. She was actually very busy during the entirety of the bus boycott. She put all of her time to that protest, and she had the time because she'd been fired from her job at the Montgomery Fair department store after her arrest. And so she spent a bulk of that year traveling the country, gaining or gathering support for the boycott. She did fundraisers, she did NAACP drives, she did radio and television interviews, all to gather support or at least publicity for the protest. And she often she represented to the public on more of a traveling basis the boycott and the demands of the boycott. And when she wasn't traveling on behalf of the protest, she was actually working to help operate the boycott. And she sometimes worked dispatch for the Montgomery Improvement Association's carpool that they developed to be able to get African Americans to their jobs or other places that they wanted to go. And I point to this because if we don't have an understanding of the larger role that Rosa Parks played within the boycott itself, we miss out on some of the work and the networks that were essential to the business of the boycott and then to its successes, and one of those being this very intricate carpool. Along with that, moving beyond the boycott, I want to say that the symbolic version of Rosa Parks that's so dominant within our understanding also tends to crowd out other women that were really essential to the boycott. And one of those that some in the audience may have heard of is Joanne Robinson. Joanne Robinson was, at the time of the boycott, the president of the Women's Political Council, which was an organization that was established in Montgomery in the 1940s by Black middle-class women with the goal of, in Robinson's words, to help African Americans improve their status. And under Robinson, the WPC, the Women's Political Council, had been lobbying city officials for years before the bus boycott to improve the bus situation. And in fact, in 1954, immediately after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Robinson actually wrote a letter to the mayor of Montgomery in which she threatens him with a boycott. She writes, "Even now, plans are being made to ride less or not at all on our buses. And that wasn't a bluff. There was a citywide plan in place for a boycott of the buses. And I think having that information is really important in terms of understanding that the bus boycott wasn't as spontaneous as it is generally portrayed within popular narratives of the movement. And in fact, technically speaking, Robinson is responsible for kicking off the boycott because upon learning of Rosa Parks' arrest that Thursday evening, she went to her workplace. She was an English teacher at Alabama State College. She went there and mimeographed hundreds of these leaflets that you're seeing on your screen, which called for a boycott the following Monday, which would be the next work day. And then also the day that Rosa Parks was to appear in court based on her arrest, right? And so in doing that, she kicks off the boycott. She gets students and they blanket the black sections of Montgomery with these leaflets, and people wake up to these flyers. And so her role is really important, again, to understanding that this bus situation had a long history, and attempts to address it had a long history. But if we are just attracted to the flame that is the iconic Rosa Parks, we don't have information about that history. Along those same lines, other women that are crowded out by our focus on Rosa Parks, again, in her symbolic symbolic version, are the many women, I'm just showing you three here, but many women who acted just as she did, who resisted the segregated seating on Montgomery's buses. Among them, Claudette Colvin, who was 15 when she was arrested in March of 1955, Ariella Broader, who was arrested in April of 1955, and then Mary Louise Smith, who was 18 when she was arrested in October of 1955. And you'll notice that all three of these women were arrested for refusing to give up their seat on a bus before Rosa Parks was. But none of them were deemed suitable for building a case or a protest around by local leaders or by the local NAACP. But it's important to have their stories. So one, we understand that Rosa Parks was not doing something that was completely uncommon. In fact, it was relatively common given the dangers for Black women to resist or at least to oppose or challenge segregated seating. I want to draw special attention to Ariella Broader, however. I'm finding more and more that my students know about Colvin and maybe Smith, but none of them ever know who Broader is. And that's really important because she's the lead plaintiff in the case Broader versus Gale. And this is the Supreme Court, or this is the court case that results in the Supreme Court affirming that segregated seating on buses is unconstitutional as it's in violation of the 14th Amendment, right? And it's this court case then that technically desegregates the buses in Montgomery and nationally. This court case is what puts the nail in the coffin of the separate but equal doctrine that emerged with the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. And yet, in my experience, I've never had a student that's heard of this case, right? They know about the boycott and they know about Rosa Parks, but they don't know about this case. They don't know about the women behind it. There were actually 5 lead plaintiffs on this case. And during the trial, they testify about their experiences, as well as many other women who are brought in to testify about their experiences. So without having information about this case, one, we don't know what actually affected desegregation on the buses, but we also don't get information about this long history of African-American women in Montgomery who were resisting the segregated seating on buses and resisting segregation in other ways. So all of that to say that this mythic idea of Rosa Parks is propping up this bus boycott story in which Rosa Parks' activism is written out, as well as other African-American women. who were essential to the bus boycott. I always argue that the Montgomery Bus Boycott was managed, maintained, and sustained by African-American women. And so having them be part of the story is crucial. So the other thing that I want to shift to now is to talk about how this image of Rosa Parks as mother of the civil rights movement, which isn't inaccurate. I'm not trying to take that status away from her, but by confining her to that idea, it actually keeps us from having a sense of her complex life, and then also the extent of her activism. Historians for several decades now have been trying to complicate our understanding of Rosa Parks, her life and her careers in activism. And the record is very clear on one particular point, that she was a lifelong activist and that she was quite radical in her activism. So while the popular narrative constructs her as an accidental activist, she had actually made a career of challenging segregation and asserting African-American civil rights for years before her arrest in 1955. And I want to just point to some examples of her work in that sense. So as early as the 1930s, early 1930s, she and her husband, Raymond Parks, were organizing in relationship to the NAACP, but organizing on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys, who were 9 African-American teenagers who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train in Scottsboro, Alabama. And Raymond Parks and Rosa Parks would hold meetings in their house of people trying to support these 9 young men. And Rosa Parks recalled at one point later in life being the lookout for these meetings because they were secretive. And she says that she can recall, she never saw so many guns as all the guns that the people who were at these meetings had brought and put on their kitchen table. In 1943, Rosa Parks joined the local NAACP, and that made her one of only 3 women at the time who were a member of that branch. One of those women being her mother, and then another one being Johnny Carr, who's pictured here next to Rosa Parks. Johnny Carr also went on to be a pretty well-known civil rights activist. And by joining the NAACP, Rosa Parks makes her activism public, and it's unusual. Again, I said she's one of only 3 women. It's unusual by contemporary gender and race politics that she's being overt in her civil rights activism in this way. This is also the same time which she began trying to register to vote, which would have also brought her to the attention of white authorities in not in a good way, right? Parks was very active in her membership, in her NAACP membership. She became, she organized the Youth Council of the NAACP, which was a local organization that helped teenagers learn about their civil rights. And then she also became secretary of the Alabama State Conference of the NAACP. And in that role, this is where I see her breaking out of kind of the confines of the prim and proper and kind of quiet figure that I think she's generally believed to be. In that role, she spoke at state conventions. And then what's most impressive to me is that she traveled around Alabama gathering evidence from African Americans who had witnessed white on Black brutality, including lynchings. And that's incredible because for her to be an African-American woman traveling around the Jim Crow South by herself, gathering information that white officials and segregationists would not want her to have was extremely dangerous, right? And it shows her commitment to her politics as a civil rights activist. And then there's her relationship with the Highlander Folk School, which began in 1955. Highlander was an integrationist social justice leadership training school in Montego, Tennessee. It actually still is. And in August 1955, just a few months before she was arrested, she attended a desegregation workshop there that was meant to help to prepare African Americans for the event of desegregating schools after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And you can see her in these integrated settings. You can see her presenting before others. This workshop began a decades-long relationship between Rosa Parks and the Highlander School, where she attended different workshops, she organized different workshops, she actually worked there for a period of time. She attended those workshops and worked alongside other civil rights activists. You can see here in two of the pictures, one on the top and one on the bottom, Martin Luther King in her presence. And I'm drawing your attention to this, to her relationship to this school, because the Highlander School was often a target of white supremacists and local white authorities for its leftist and integrationist programs and policies. And you can see evidence of that here. In 1965, in relationship to Dr. King's work on behalf of voting rights, segregationists, they erected billboards and distributed flyers that showed him in attendance at a workshop at the Highlander School, which those, the billboards and flyers identified as a communist training school. The purpose here being to paint him with the brush of communism, which was a serious liability in a Cold War context, right? But they also indict Rosa Parks because she was there, and she was actually more often a student of Highlander than King was. And so one of the side effects of thinking about Rosa Parks in relationship to the bus boycott is that we don't have a lot of information, or we don't have understanding generally of her contribution and her participation in other events. And here are photographs of her in attendance at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom movement. She did not speak there, but she was in attendance and she was honored there. Actually, the women were not really allowed to participate in a more vocal sense, but that's a story for a different time. And then in 1965, there was the Selma Campaign, in which Dr. King, along with several civil rights organizations, were organizing on behalf of voting rights. And that campaign was to culminate in a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, the state capital. And the first attempt at that march, you can see here the marchers coming over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The first attempt at that march led to what is known as Bloody Sunday, where local authorities, local and state police mowed down the activists, the marchers, clubbing them, mowed them down with horses, used tear gas. And these images are often cited in relationship to Lyndon B. Johnson's motivation of getting civil rights legislation, or the Voting Rights Act, through Congress in 1965. There are two more attempts to march from Selma to Montgomery, and on the third attempt, this is pictured here, they do reach Montgomery and they take their demands to the steps of the state capitol. And also present in this event is Rosa Parks. In fact, she's literally just right out of frame, which I find so interesting. And it's not just that she marches, she actually speaks. Once they get to the Capitol, she addresses the crowd. And in doing so, she actually refers to those leaflets and says that Martin Luther King Jr. was not a student at that school that they've identified as a communist school, but I was, right? So she is staking a claim in terms of her activism and the extent of her activism, and I think the radicalness of her activism. This is a photograph, which I love because I just love the glasses. This is a photograph of Rosa Parks at the Poor People's March at the Washington Monument in 1968, where she informally addressed members of the protest. And then I also want to argue that the symbolic version of Rosa Parks constricts her just to civil rights activism, when in fact her activism went beyond the issue of civil rights or voting rights. And here you can see an example of that, where she is protesting apartheid in 1984 outside of the South African Embassy in Washington, D.C. And then I really want to take a moment to draw attention to her work on behalf of sexual assault survivors. Historians Daniel McGuire and Jean Theo Harris have both written comprehensive histories in which they detail the extent to which Rosa Parks actively fought on behalf of African-American women who were the victims of sexual violence, typically rape from white men. And one of the more notable cases is the case of Recy Taylor in 1944, who was a 24-year-old African-American woman who was abducted on her way walking home from church by 6 white men who gang raped her. Parks investigated that rape and then also formed a committee for equal justice for Mrs. Recy Taylor, which brought a lot of national prominence to that case. Nevertheless, Recy Taylor's rapists were not indicted. And when that happened, actually, Rosa Parks wrote a letter to the governor imploring him to, quote, remove all obstacles barring justice in this case. So again, speaking to her commitment and to her assertiveness in engaging different systems. And we now know that Parks herself was almost a victim of sexual assault at the age of 18 when a white neighbor attempted to rape her. So perhaps that, fueled some of her activism in this light, but she fought on behalf of sexual assault survivors late into her life. The last point I want to make in terms of her activism and its relationship to the symbolic idea of Rosa Parks is that idea, while it clouds out the broader nature of her activism, it also doesn't allow for her complex sensibilities as an activist. In her symbolic form, she's held up as a patron of nonviolence, which was the primary strategy that defined the civil rights movement. But in actuality, she was not an adherent to nonviolence, and she actually called Malcolm X her personal hero. And I really appreciate this photograph because it's a photograph of Parks in 1979, visiting a Black Panther school in Oakland, California. And she was making that visit, or she made that visit during a visit to the Bay Area where she was fundraising for the Highlander School. And I think there you have this perfect example of how all of these different Black freedom politics converge in Rosa Parks in terms of nonviolence, integration, but also Black power. They're all coming together in this one activist. So she had a complex profile as an activist. And so given the fact that we have all of this evidence, what is most interesting to me is how this image of Rosa Parks as this accidental, tired, elderly, polite protester continues to reign within our society. And I think that she belongs to a set of symbolic Black figures, and we like to do this to our Black figures. And I think about this a lot during February, right? Because it's Black History Month. And these collages are what were returned when I did a Google image search for the term Black History Month. And you can see the same figures come up over and over again. And so there's a set of Black figures that we like to celebrate, but we also typically only celebrate them in a very simplistic and their most heroic form. And I think that's because that's inspiring. It's also easier to understand, or at least we think it is, and maybe easier to teach. I would argue that it's less interesting and compelling when you teach some historical figures in their most simplistic form. But I think that we lose something in providing only a slice of what Rosa Parks' true value and true commitment was as an activist. And so in a Q&A, I would love to field any questions that you have that I might help further complicate the narrative. And I didn't speak to it now, but one of the things that really interests me is how the celebration of figures like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King in their symbolic form affects African Americans' abilities to protest or to advance their politics now. So I'll leave it with that and stop sharing. And I welcome any questions that you have.
So Dr. Greer, there is one question here from Sherry Tolliver. And her question is, was Rosa Parks' arrest planned? She's read where she has stated that it was not, but the notion persists that she was planted and that this was all prearranged.
Right. I've definitely heard that narrative, and there are people who will argue on both sides. My students, if and when they've heard anything different about Rosa Parks other than the tired old lady with tired feet, will often ask me if that's the case, or they will tell me that that is the case. And what I tell them, and this is what I understand from my research, is that Rosa Parks was a plant in as much as she was a member of the NAACP who was entirely inclined to act the way that she did. All of her activism up to that moment bespeaks to the fact that she would be inclined at some point to challenge segregation. And in fact, she had done so on a bus almost a decade earlier with the same bus driver. The fact that she was arrested on this occasion is what makes this an entirely different story. But I don't need Rosa Parks to be a plant. I think that it is, I think it's maybe a more conspiratorial story and maybe interesting in that way. But I think what's a more useful story is one that allows us to see the roots of that decision, and that it makes it seem actually a very likely decision.
Okay, this next question comes from Erica Lee Simca. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. How much of the popular image of Rosa Parks do you think is related to her being a woman in a time of more male domination than now compared to ongoing whitewashing of history? She says, I understand intersectionality makes it impossible to separate her gender and race, but she's still interested in your analysis of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a hugely important question. And, in different occasions when I'm talking about Parks, I spend a lot of time talking about how gender politics of the time, but then also subsequent gender expectations have worked to give us this idea of Rosa Parks. Because one of the things that's most interesting, everything that I told you about Rosa Parks in terms of her activism before, after, outside of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, none of that's a secret, right? Like none of that is hard to dig up. But because of gender politics at the time, it was within the civil rights movement, particularly within a Jim Crow setting, much more likely that Black ministers were going to be at the fore and be the spokespeople for a movement. They were less vulnerable to reprisals, but it would also have been the custom of a Black community at that point in time. Rosa Parks herself really contributed to this idea that we have of her, because during the Montgomery Bus Boycott, one of the reasons that she selected is that she is considered to be respectable in a way that Claudette Colvin wasn't, in a way that Mary Louise Smith wasn't, in a way that many other women before her were not. And that is a responsibility that she takes very seriously. And throughout the Montgomery Bus Boycott, she performs performs in a way that I see as being very intentionally in keeping with idea of middle-class respectable femininity, not just respectability, but femininity. And I think that contributes to this idea that we have of her. And when Jesse Jackson is holding her hand, she's not demanding the microphone, right? She in some way really does assist this idea that we have of her.
Sort of along those lines, Terry Graham's question is very related to that. She states that she's only actually heard of one of the women of the three previous that you mentioned, Mary Louise, for example, Claudette. Can you sort of expound on why those three women were not considered appropriate for the same kind of notoriety, if you will, that Rosa Parks received?
Sure. In those cases, specifically with Claudette Colvin, two things worked against her. It was reported that after the fact that she was swearing and cussing and kicking when they took her off the bus. And so right there, that's not the image that you want. But more, you know, what really damned her is that she shortly thereafter became pregnant out of wedlock, and immediately, because they were building a protest around her, the NAACP was getting ready to use her as a test case, a court case, and they dropped her. With Mary Louise Smith, two things happened. She was Catholic, which was not typical among African Americans in the South or in Montgomery. And then her father was rumored to be an alcoholic. And so you can really see the Black leaders, including Rosa Parks, being very aware of image politics, being very aware of needing to have the right, or at least someone you could make seem to be the right victim at the head of their movement. And in fact, Rosa Parks does speak to those respectability politics at that time. Joanne Robinson was extremely angry when they dropped Claudette Colvin. So not everyone thought that image politics should be the deciding factor there. In a lot of the cases before Rosa Parks, it was that women perhaps engaged in fighting with the bus driver or fighting with other passengers. So Rosa Parks, because she could, she had a very good reputation and was well liked among all different classes of Black Montgomery. So, and then she could also fit the mold, the picture that they were looking to put forth.
Thank you for that. Here's an interesting question from Nancy Kavanaugh. Do you think it's more comfortable or safe for white people to put Rosa Parks in this container, the iconic image?
100%. 100%. I really appreciate the question because it allows me to say that you asked me. 100%. And I don't think just white people. I think, you know, I talk sometimes about how I'll have conversations with even in my research with older African Americans, and they will speak about Rosa Parks very much in keeping with this popular idea, and it's not wrong, right? And particularly for, you know, like if I think about my father, who's in his mid-70s and actually around during the civil rights movement, I can't refute his idea of this person at all. But I think it's nice for us to have an inspiring figure, you know, that's triumphant, but then it's not lost upon me when you look at those collages of the Black History Month, you know, figures, there's no representation of Black power advocates. There's no representation even of Black Lives Matter advocates in there, you know, and I should, you know, confess that I put that slide together a week ago, so maybe things have changed. But in the years that I have been using that technique just to check, that's always what returns with Black History Month. And I think that we elevate the kinder, gentler versions of the nonviolent protesters in a way that makes that the acceptable Black protest in ways that are really challenging for subsequent or alternative types or options of protest for people of color.
And following up on that from Sam Robbins, in our current climate, when discussing with others who are not interested in learning and seeing this contextualization as rewriting, quote unquote, history, do you have any tips or advice on addressing this with them?
That's a great question. One of the things that I have started to do, I don't know if I would say I've become skilled at doing, is to act, instead of trying to convince, or assert my position or beg for some, you know, hearing of what I know, is to start to ask what is objectionable to them about a possible different version of this figure or that figure? What does it mean if Rosa Parks actually was not an adherent of nonviolence, right? What does it mean if, you know, Rosa Parks never had children and worked outside of the home and was actually, you know, not a member of the middle class? And, you know, what are the attachments to that? And that's typically, for many topics of race, how I've begun to go about those is, what is the, I wouldn't say what is the fear, but what would it mean if? Doesn't have to be, but what would it mean if? And then usually that allows for a conversation where you start to at least identify what the other person's investments are, if not fears, what their investments are. And you can have a conversation that's actually speaking to those. But if somebody's determined, and it's important, I say this a lot in the classroom, and it really is, I don't ever want to take a figure, particularly a figure for marginalized people, that it is compelling and just knock it down, right? And then not put anything there in the place. I truly believe one of the biggest crimes, or, you know, committed by the symbolic version of Rosa Parks, is what it does to her, right? What it robs about her extensive record as a politically involved, socially aware person, right? So I'm not trying to knock her down or take her out of the picture. I actually just want us to have more of her.
And sort of along similar lines, there's been a lot of recent scholarship, and one that comes to mind for this next question, again from Sherry Tulliver, is recent research from Martha S. Jones, who puts Black women specifically at the vanguard of nearly every activist movement in the United States. And she asks, can you speak to Rosa Parks' predecessors, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Polly Murray are the examples she's listed, all who refused to give up their seats on streetcars, buses, and trains, and how the fact that women have been resisting for almost a century, and I would say 2 centuries, really.
Right. No, exactly. You know, I did my master's thesis on Montgomery Bus Boycott. And, you know, I went into that with this idea of Rosa Parks. And, you know, so one, that was exploded for me. But what was really exploded for me was this idea that the Montgomery Bus Boycott was the first time that, you know, a woman, let alone African-Americans, had, you know, organized against segregated seating, other than the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And Montgomery had prior boycotts within, you know, that city of the trolleys and the buses. And I think one of the things that's important to understand there, because my students will often ask why it has been women who have done that. And when we're talking about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, I give them the example of, well, I tell them that African-American men in Montgomery would have had the very recent example of Emmett Till in terms of stepping out of line in a way that African-American women had a little bit more license to do, but there is plenty of documentation of women in Montgomery, for example, being violently punished for challenging segregated seating on trolleys and buses. So in no way do I want to make it seem like they, you know, like, oh, it was a lot safer for them. But there's a lot of testimony as to African-American women or African-American men on buses when a situation would arise, conflict between an African-American woman and the bus driver or passengers, African-American men getting up and going out the back. Right? Just understanding how charged a situation that was. So I think to some degree, African-American women have had some room to maneuver in a way that has made it such that they have taken any opportunity that they have. And that is why I agree that you typically are going to find them at the vanguard of most social movements in US history.
And here's another one of those questions where it's really, I'm glad people feel like this is a safe place to explore these and ask these kind of questions. But June Higgins, she writes, thank you for opening my eyes and mind about Rosa Parks. Do you think that the symbolic idea of her as a tired old lady and other civil rights leaders as nonviolent, and she puts that in quotes, is part of the white sense of quote unquote good blacks being nice people and not to be feared?
Yeah, that's along with the other question in terms of, do I think that this image is something that, white people feel more comfortable with? I do. I think so. And this is why in answering that question, I also brought, an older Black generation into it, because something that I feel a lot within the classroom is young students of African descent, kind of poo-pooing the civil rights movement and their respectability politics, and and they're resisting a need to conform to dominant norms, or to be respectable, or to be safe, to be able to experience or demand equality. And I think there's a lot of nervousness across racial lines about Black figures that appear to be demanding too much. For many people of color, it's out of fear. It's fear for themselves and fear for those people. I think for members of the dominant class, I think it's being fearful of those people and the examples that they might set, and maybe the ground that they might gain.
And then going back to your slide of the different images of Black History Month, do you find that, or do you feel that anger isn't given value? The question here is, aren't these images part of the patriarchal Hollywood idea of quote unquote attractive people? So it's still kept under the patriarchal idea of tidy.
Yeah.
And anger really isn't given value as a moving force in these activist movements.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and not to be a broken record, there's a real reason for why African Americans, might not want to use anger, might not want to think that, might not want external groups to think that they might use anger. But, as an African American woman, to be angry, to appear angry, right? I mean, that is just, that is, the first thing you learn not to do if you're trying to, in a professional setting or a political setting, trying to not be dismissed as emotional, But one of the things that upsets me about not having more information about Rosa Parks' Black power politics is because I think it would be a really effective way to lead people into that history, that you might take them further along in that history. The US government, when African Americans displayed anger as part of their politics, the Black Panther Party for self-defense, right? The crackdown was swift and immediate and pretty much total. So I think that there very practically speaking is not allowance for anger from African Americans in our protests. I think it is part of the reason that in different presentations, I often talk about the most famous image of Rosa Parks, which is her sitting on a bus in front of a white man, staring out the window. And it was the image that appeared, it was the image that became like that political cartoonists used when she died. Apple used it as their website page when she died. And she's very calm, and it kind of resembles or evokes the moment when she was arrested. And I think that's just I think that has become the way that African Americans are supposed to advance our politics, because we look at the civil rights movement as a very triumphant narrative, partly because we have all of these triumphant figures and narratives about the civil rights movement. But more and more historians like myself and even my students are asking, let's really evaluate the successes of the civil rights movement, because the legislation, which are the primary successes, we can see all sorts of ways in which that has been falling short. Right? So if we elevate the form of protest associated with those successes, and those successes maybe didn't amount to the gains that we thought they did or haven't, then we need to be able to explore other forms of protest. But if we're locked into only a particular type of protest, a particular type of emotion, I don't think that's accidental, right? I think it's very challenging, but I also think it's very structural.
I think you may have just outlined your next book project. I would like to see that book written.
You may be right. Right.
Well, Dr. Greer, we appreciate you coming on and sharing this very critical history with us, and the different sides of Rosa Parks is not immediately available to us, you know, in public school education or the textbooks. One of the things we like to do here, and maybe I should have given you a heads up about this, I apologize. But one of the things we like to do here at the museum is we ask our guests to leave us with what is the number one takeaway? You may have just answered the question, but what is the number one takeaway you would like audiences to go away from this program with, or what call to action would you like to issue to our audience?
Can I do two?
Of course, absolutely.
Okay. So the takeaway, I have a takeaway question for the audience, and then they could share that with others, is who do you need your Black historical figures to be and why? Because I had to think about that when I was doing my master's thesis. I wanted to write a thesis that glorified and honored the image that I had grown up with, and it took better part of 18 months for me to realize I was writing against the evidence, right? So this isn't just about the white people out there, you know, like who do you need your Black historical figures or your Black leaders, whatever it may, who do you need them to be? The call to action, you actually, it sprung to mind because you were talking about education. Every year I teach about Rosa Parks and expect that my students are going to be like, Professor Greer, yep, we know, we understand. She had this, and it never happens. There's the books out there. Like I said, the evidence isn't buried under there. It never happens. And what that says to me is the education they're getting to that point will not allow for these stories. And so earlier on in their education, we need to be demanding as parents, but also as educators, you know, we need to be demanding the resources, the time, and the allowance to give them more complex figures. I am married to a high school history teacher, and it's clear to me he has no time to expand on his own knowledge of these, you know, again, that's structural, you know, so he has an image, and with no malice, he is giving that to his students, right? And so we need to demand of our education institutions that they put forth, allow for, and encourage more complex historical figures, period, but particularly of marginalized communities.
Thank you for that. That's very thought-provoking and very worth taking the time for each of us to explore on our own and to take this presentation away with us. So thank you for your time. Thank you to our audience for all your questions and your comments. Thank you for having the courage to and feeling comfortable to know that this is a safe space to ask some of the difficult questions that we need to be asking of each other right now. So thank you for that. But again, Dr. Greer, thank you for your time. And again, this is being recorded, so you can rewatch this. And if you missed anything or you want to review anything, this recording will be up on our website. Typically takes about a week or so for it to become available, but we do hope you will look for that on the Sundays at Home landing page at www.womenshistory.org. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this Sunday afternoon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the questions. This has been a delight. Have a good night, everyone.